Tonight, we uncover the story of a man who never signed a decree, never wore a crown, and never sat on the throne, yet reshaped the Vatican more than any pope in history. A silent architect of power whose name appears nowhere, but whose fingerprints stain every century. He did not command armies or write scripture. He whispered edicts into time itself. He buried maps, rewrote calendars, and invented saints to seal the cracks in history. Cathedrals were carved with his ratios, archives opened only when he allowed. He moved through monasteries like a ghost, leaving behind no trail but obedience. Those who noticed him too closely disappeared behind trimmed margins and erased ledgers. This is not a story of conspiracy. It is the architecture of belief itself. A shadow behind the cross, a voice that told popes when to forget. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. You're about to see how silence built an empire. They say power speaks loudly, but in the Vatican, true power speaks in silence. In the winter of the year 1573, a strange whisper began to drift through the marble halls of Rome. It was not the sound of bells or prayer, but of rumour. Someone, it was said, had begun to shape the direction of the church itself. No one knew his name. He signed nothing, appeared in no record, and never stood beside the Pope during ceremonies. Yet decisions began to change. Orders, once firm, were delayed. Letters, once sealed, were quietly rewritten. A hand unseen guided the will of the most powerful institution on earth. At first, it seemed impossible. How could one man, without title or crown, steer the course of faith itself? But those who served within the papal court began to notice strange patterns. A council meeting rescheduled without explanation. A law announced, then withdrawn. A letter from the Holy Father written in his hand, yet with words not his own. Every shift was small, subtle, easy to miss. But together they formed a new rhythm, a quiet rewriting of destiny. Some said he was a monk. Others swore he was a scholar from Florence, a survivor of forbidden studies. Whatever his origin, the man became known only as the shadow leader, the ghost who ruled by omission. He did not command armies, nor did he seek riches. His influence was not built on fear, but on absence. He learned that silence, used correctly, could bend the world more easily than any sword. The Vatican of the 16th century was a world built on noise. The chants of priests, the hammering of builders raising cathedrals, the endless debates of theologians arguing over salvation. Yet beneath it all, silence became the true weapon. When the Pope hesitated before signing a decree, when a bishop found his report misplaced, when an archive door was suddenly locked, it was said that the shadow leader had passed by. The first trace of him appears not in letters, but in what is missing from them. Gaps between sentences, names half written, records that stop mid-thought. It was as if someone had carefully erased himself while erasing others, and yet the effects of his work rippled outward. Alliances shifted, enemies vanished. The church grew more guarded, more deliberate, more mysterious. Rome began to change its rhythm. Knowledge that once flowed freely between scholars and clergy now moved behind closed doors. Decisions once shared among councils were whispered only between the Pope and his invisible guide. Historians would later call this the beginning of the silent era of Vatican power, an age when words mattered less than the spaces between them. Some claim the shadow leader never existed at all, that he was only a legend born from fear and awe. But if that were true, why did the archives grow thicker with blank pages during those years? Why did no one record who truly decided which books were burned and which were saved? The Vatican does not fear noise. It fears the silence that hides intention. And in that silence, a new kind of ruler was born, one who commanded not through faith or fear, but through the careful art of vanishing. In the dim light of a Vatican scriptorium, the sound of scraping filled the air. It was not the sound of quills on parchment, but the slow, deliberate scratch of a blade lifting ink from vellum. One name, carefully written in black, vanished under the steady hand of a monk. The parchment looked unremarkable, only a simple ledger of donors and patrons. Yet, in that small act of erasure, a man was quietly removed from history. The monk who performed the task did not question the order. His instructions had arrived sealed in wax, marked with the papal crest. He was told to correct a record, to ensure accuracy. But accuracy was not the goal. The Vatican understood the power of documents better than any kingdom on earth. What was written endured, and what was erased ceased to exist. One name gone meant one influence erased, one legacy cut short. The monk was young, barely 30, but he knew enough to feel the weight of his work. The ink he removed was not just words, it was memory. The man whose name once filled that line had funded the translation of ancient Greek manuscripts. He had spoken too freely about knowledge belonging to all people, not only the clergy. Now, his donations, his letters, and even his grave marker would follow the same fate as his name. It was the first task assigned to a figure no one yet knew would rise to control the heart of the Vatican's hidden world. He had begun as a scribe, a man of letters and silence. Yet with every document he edited, he learned something crucial. That truth did not die in flames. It vanished in paperwork. He saw that to shape history, one did not need armies, only ink and permission. And so he began to study the art of omission. He understood how easily memory could be rewritten by changing a word, altering a date, removing a single name from a line of text. Each act left no smoke, no blood, only clean parchment and perfect handwriting. In those days, the Vatican's archives were a labyrinth of knowledge, growing faster than any man could read. Thousands of scrolls, letters, and codices lined the walls. But behind their quiet order, a slow transformation was underway. Histories of ancient rulers, writings of philosophers, and maps of forgotten worlds were being reviewed, copied, or corrected. The monk watched as small adjustments changed great truths. A map redrawn erased a kingdom. A rewritten translation turned science into allegory. A saint appeared in place of a scholar. He began to see that power lay not in creation, but in removal. As the years passed, the monk became trusted for his precision, his handwriting flawless, his loyalty unquestioned. No one noticed that with each correction, he was also correcting himself, erasing his own presence, leaving no trace of his rise. The Vatican would later remember only the perfection of its records, not the quiet man who had made them. And in that perfect silence, the shadow leader was born. By day he was like any other monk, head bowed, lips whispering prayers in the candlelight of the abbey. He copied scripture line by line, each word of Latin a thread in the tapestry of faith. But when night fell and the chants faded, his true work began. Behind the stone walls of the library, where only a few were ever allowed to enter, he became someone else. The same hand that copied holy verses now reached for forbidden manuscripts sealed in wooden chests. To the brothers of the order, he was a model of devotion. To the silent few who truly knew him, he was something more dangerous, a guardian of knowledge that was never meant to survive. His room smelled of ink and dust. On his table lay 2 books, one open to the Gospels, the other to the writings of Pythagoras. By the light of a single candle, he learned that truth could wear 2 faces, one holy, one human, one accepted, one forbidden. The Vatican believed that knowledge needed control. The monk began to realize that control did not always mean destruction, it could mean selection. What you chose to copy determined what the world would one day believe, and what you left behind would vanish as if it had never existed. He began to see that censorship was a blunt weapon, but selection was precise. When ordered to copy the works of a saint, he would subtly alter words to smooth contradictions. When told to destroy an ancient text, he would copy it secretly first, hiding it under the name of a harmless sermon. In the eyes of his superiors, he was obedient. In truth, he had learned to serve two masters. The church demanded purity, but the mind demanded freedom. And between those two fires, he found a path that only silence could protect. He watched as visiting scholars came and went, some proudly offering new ideas, others leaving in shame when their theories displeased the bishops. He realized that truth had never been silenced by the sword, only redirected by those who decided which books were worth saving. The monk began to keep his own hidden index, a list of writings too valuable to lose. He hid them in hollow walls, beneath altar stones, behind false bindings in dusty volumes. He understood that one day they might be needed again when the world was ready to ask questions. And so his nights stretched into years. He became older, quieter, and more invisible. His name faded from the abbey rolls, but his choices shaped the minds of centuries to come. The Vatican would later call his work an act of devotion. Scholars might one day call it rebellion, but for him it was neither. It was survival, not for himself, but for the truth. And in that double life, the monk learned the most dangerous secret of all, that silence could protect not only lies, but also the fragments of truth that still glowed beneath the ashes. There were libraries built by kings and emperors, grand halls filled with scrolls that carried the pride of nations. But hidden beneath the surface of Europe, another library was being born, one that belonged to no crown and answered to no ruler. It did not stand beneath domes or arches. It had no marble floors or gilded doors. It existed in fragments scattered across monasteries, cathedrals, and secret chambers, connected only by memory and trust. The man behind it was no longer just a monk. He had become something far more elusive, a keeper of the invisible. By the year 1590, he had learned how to move manuscripts without being seen. Each time a monastery closed, he quietly arranged for its books to be carried to safer hands. When wars or fires threatened to destroy knowledge, he appeared like a ghost, collecting, sorting, deciding what should live and what must vanish. To the outside world, he seemed a simple servant of the church, but those who knew whispered that he was building something vast, a hidden network of archives bound not by walls, but by loyalty. In an age when kings taxed ideas and bishops claimed ownership of words, he imagined a sanctuary that would belong only to truth itself. Each volume carried a secret mark, a symbol small enough to escape the eye but clear enough for another member of the network to recognize. Over time, hundreds of cloisters across Europe held pieces of the hidden library, each containing knowledge, forbidden or forgotten. There were texts on geometry, astronomy, and healing, works of poets banned for questioning creation, maps that showed coastlines unknown to Christendom. The Vatican's official archives grew in number, but the shadow leader's invisible library grew in depth. He knew that written catalogues could betray them, so he created no list, no record, no index. The catalogue lived only in his mind and in the memories of a few chosen scribes. When he travelled, he carried nothing but a rosary and a small scrap of parchment covered with ciphered symbols. Even the Pope himself would not have recognized what it meant. The hidden library became a living creature, breathing through its guardians. Each time a book was taken, another was hidden. Each time a name was erased, a memory was preserved in silence. It was a system born of necessity but guided by purpose, to protect the knowledge that kings and priests would destroy if they could. The shadow leader believed that someday, when the world awoke from its long sleep, these books would be needed again. He was not hoarding the past, he was saving the future. No kingdom could claim it, no army could burn it, no pope could ban it, because it existed beyond walls and time. The library that answered to no king was not made of stone. It was made of faith in knowledge, and of the silence that guards it until the world is ready to listen again. Time was once measured by the movement of the sun and the whisper of the seasons. Farmers watched the stars, sailors followed the moon, and empires rose and fell according to their own calendars. But by the end of the 16th century, the Vatican decided that time itself must serve the Church. The change came quietly, hidden behind talk of corrections and holy order. A single stroke of the pen would shift the rhythm of centuries. The man who guided it was the same silent figure who had already learned how to control memory through ink. Now he turned his eyes to the sky. The Julian calendar, used since the days of Caesar, had drifted 10 days from the true solar year. Astronomers had known it for generations, but few dared to fix it, for to move time was to move heaven itself. Yet the Church declared the error unholy. Easter no longer fell in its proper season. Feast days no longer matched the signs of the heavens. The correction, they said, would restore divine harmony. But the true purpose ran deeper. The shadow leader saw that whoever commanded the calendar commanded history. The new system would not only realign time, but reset the center of human life around Rome. In October of the year 1582, 10 entire days were erased from existence. People went to sleep on the 4th and woke up on the 15th. Birthdays, debts, and promises vanished in a single breath. Many protested, believing they had been robbed of time itself, but the Church insisted it was necessary, that the world had simply been brought closer to God's clock. What no one realized was that those missing days created a gap, a silent void into which memories could disappear. Documents dated within that period were adjusted, rewritten, or lost. Historians centuries later would call it a correction, yet in truth it was a recalibration of the timeline. The shadow leader used the reform to quietly edit not only the present but the past. Certain records were reissued with altered dates. Older papal decrees were backdated to match the new calendar, giving the illusion of prophecy fulfilled. The Church became the keeper of the universal clock, and all nations that joined the reform bowed not just to astronomy but to authority. Even time itself now flowed through the Vatican's gates. The man who had once erased names from ledgers now erased days from eternity. He realized that history could be reshaped not by rewriting words, but by shifting when they were said. Each festival, each fast, each saint's day became a reminder that the Church alone measured divine rhythm, and as people adjusted their calendars, they unknowingly adjusted their memories. Time was no longer an open river, it was a circle, and at its center stood the Vatican, holding the knife that carved it. The fires that once burned books began to die out, not because the Church grew merciful, but because a new method had taken their place. Flames were noisy, visible, and left behind the scent of guilt. Silence, on the other hand, left no trace. It was in the early years of the 17th century when a quiet meeting took place inside a small Benedictine monastery outside Rome. The air was heavy with incense, and the doors were sealed from within. 3 orders gathered there: the Benedictines, the Dominicans, and the Jesuits. Each held a different kind of power. The Benedictines guarded the libraries, the Dominicans held the authority of doctrine, and the Jesuits controlled education. Together, they could shape the entire flow of knowledge across Europe. The man who called them together had no official title, but his reputation was known in every corridor of the Vatican. He was the one who made things disappear without burning them. He proposed a pact, one that would change the future of learning and belief forever. Nothing would be destroyed, he said. Destruction was wasteful and crude. Instead, every forbidden idea, every dangerous book would be redirected. Some would be locked away. Some would be rewritten. Some would be disguised within the language of faith. The Benedictines agreed first. They would preserve the physical manuscripts, but only under guidance. The Dominicans followed, promising to adjust doctrine when needed to absorb heresy into scripture. The Jesuits hesitated, for they were men of logic and education, but they saw the advantage of control through redirection rather than fire. By the end of the night, the Silence Accord was signed, not on parchment, but in memory. There would be no record, no signature, no proof, only results. From that day onward, no heretical text was to be burned publicly unless it served a symbolic purpose. Instead, it was copied, altered, or filed into the secret network of archives. Knowledge that once risked being lost forever was instead buried alive. The shadow leader knew that silence was stronger than denial. When people see flames, they remember. But when a book is hidden, time does the work for you. It fades from memory until its absence feels natural. Under the Silence Accord, Europe entered an era where even scholars began to forget what had once existed. Libraries appeared full, yet most of their content said the same thing. Sermons replaced science. Hymns replaced history. The Church's unity grew stronger, not by erasing truth, but by controlling its direction. The pact turned monasteries into filters, schools into instruments of memory, and silence into a law more powerful than scripture. Those who kept the accord swore lifelong secrecy. To break it was to lose not only one's position, but one's existence in the records. The world outside thought the fires had stopped. In truth, the flames had only been moved indoors, burning quietly in the minds of men who had learned that silence could shape eternity. In the year 1607, a small ship arrived in the port of Civitavecchia, carrying a chest bound for Rome. Inside were maps gathered from scholars across the Mediterranean, charts drawn by Arab astronomers, Greek navigators, and sailors from lands the Church called uncharted. When the chest reached the Vatican, its contents were said to be gifts for the papal library. But those who carried it never saw the maps again. The men who handled the transfer were sworn to silence, and within days the cartographers who had drawn the originals were quietly erased from record. The world believed they had died at sea. The truth was far stranger. The shadow leader had turned his attention to geography, the language of empires. Whoever held the maps held the borders of the known world. He saw that control over maps meant control over belief. For if people could not see beyond the lines drawn for them, they would never imagine that anything else existed. So he began a campaign of collection that stretched across decades. Monks, disguised as scholars, travelled through Spain, Portugal, and the Ottoman territories, seeking charts, atlases, and fragments of ancient navigation texts. They borrowed them in the name of preservation, promising to copy and return them. None ever came back. Within the Vatican, a secret chamber was prepared beneath the main library. Its walls were lined with drawers, labelled not by region, but by the names of saints. Saint Jerome concealed Asia. Saint Helena marked the coasts of Africa. Saint Thomas the Doubter hid the edges of a vast southern land no one dared to name. When questioned about the missing materials, officials claimed the originals were being protected from decay. In truth, the Vatican had begun to redraw the world. Certain islands vanished from official charts. Others appeared for the first time with Latin names. The outlines of continents were softened, adjusted, or rewritten to match theological narratives. One mysterious map depicted the coastline of a frozen continent, centuries before explorers ever claimed to reach it. Another showed a land bridge connecting Africa and South America, labelled only as Garden of the First Dawn. The Shadow Leader ordered these maps sealed away. He understood their danger. Knowledge of lands outside the Church's authority threatened to shift faith away from Rome. If the world was larger than Scripture described, belief itself might collapse. Instead, he filed the maps under saints' names, creating a coded geography that only a few initiates could read. Scholars later who studied the official charts found strange errors, coastlines that seemed to move or disappear between editions. They never realized the truth that geography itself had been baptized and bound to obedience. The cartographers who once dreamed of mapping creation had unwittingly drawn its limits. Their debt was not gold or fame but silence, paid forever in erased names and blank oceans where truth once lived. Every cathedral in Europe tells a story, but not all stories are written in words. Some are built into stone, encoded in the lines and ratios of arches, pillars, and domes. During the early 17th century, as the Vatican extended its reach across art and architecture, the Shadow Leader found a new language of control, geometry. To the faithful, a cathedral was a place of worship. To him, it was a structure of influence, a silent teacher of obedience. He understood what few dared to say aloud. That proportion could train the mind as surely as Scripture trained the soul. So he began to work with the Church's finest architects, whispering ideas that would shape the next generation of sacred buildings. The designs they drew were breathtaking, yet each line served more than beauty. The grand arches, for example, drew every eye upward, reminding worshippers of heaven's unreachable height. The narrow aisles directed movement toward the altar, guiding the body into submission. Even the spacing between columns was calculated according to divine ratios that mirrored hierarchy, one perfect order beneath another. What appeared as art was in truth a mathematical sermon. The Shadow Leader introduced subtle variations into these designs, altering angles and curves to reflect the Church's structure itself. One centre surrounded by many followers, all leading back to Rome. No one outside the inner circle understood this pattern. To the common builder, it was simply divine proportion. To those who knew, it was a hidden system meant to train generations through space and sight. When sunlight entered through stained glass, it did not fall by chance. It illuminated only certain parts of the floor at specific hours, choreographed to match the rhythm of prayers. Even shadows obeyed doctrine. The cathedral became a living diagram of submission, where beauty disguised command. People walked within it, unaware that every step, every line of sight, every echo of a chant was designed to make them feel small before the presence of power. The Shadow Leader's influence spread quietly. Cities competed to build larger, more perfect cathedrals, unknowingly spreading the same geometry of obedience across the continent. Some architects suspected the truth. One, a mason from Lyon, wrote that the vaults themselves seemed to whisper instructions. His notes disappeared before he could finish them. Another tried to design a church with open geometry, free of central hierarchy, but his plans were rejected and his name erased from the records. By the mid-1600s, almost every major cathedral followed the same invisible formula. Those who entered felt awe, but they also felt order. The design did not merely reflect faith, it enforced it. Through proportion and silence, the Shadow Leader achieved what no decree could. He built obedience into stone, carved submission into symmetry, and wrapped control in the language of beauty. And so for centuries, millions would kneel beneath arches that taught them without words that heaven, like power, was always above them. In the quiet chambers of the Vatican during the year 1621, a group of scribes gathered around a long oak table. They were not writing sermons or recording miracles. They were creating people. The church faced a problem it could not admit. Between the reigns of certain popes, there were gaps in the record, years where nothing was written, no decrees signed, no saints canonized. Historians began to whisper questions. Who ruled during those empty years? Why did the papal chain, said to be unbroken since St. Peter, suddenly fade into silence? The shadow leader understood that silence could protect, but too much of it could reveal, so he proposed a solution that would become one of the most subtle manipulations in history. If history had holes, fill them with holiness. Hagiographies, the biographies of saints, would be the perfect bridge. They would not be questioned because they were written as miracles, not as facts. And so the work began. Monks received instructions to compose new lives of saints, figures said to have lived precisely during the missing years. They gave them names that echoed older ones to blend with the rhythm of history. Saint Valerian, Saint Domitus, Saint Aurelia. None of them left bones, relics, or graves. Yet each was granted a feast day. Their stories were crafted with precision, blending fragments of older legends with local folklore. They performed small miracles, healed peasants, endured persecution, and always, in the final pages, gave their blessing to Rome. Each new saint became a living patch over a tear in time. To the public, these stories were beautiful tales of faith. To the Vatican, they were evidence that the Church had never faltered. The shadow leader oversaw every detail, approving which saints would appear, which miracles would be remembered, and which names would echo through future prayers. Even painters joined the deception, creating portraits of people who never existed, their faces imagined, their halos bright. In towns across Europe, chapels were built in their honour, candles burned for them, prayers were said in their names, and history itself forgot that they had been invented. Scholars who later noticed the patterns found that many of these saints appeared during periods of poor documentation or political unrest. But by then, the legends were too deeply woven into faith to be removed. The Vatican never needed to forge entire centuries. It only had to fill them with enough holiness to make doubt seem blasphemous. The shadow leader had found a new kind of truth, one that did not depend on reality, but on belief. A saint could be born from a blank page if the story was told with devotion. And so the Church's past became a seamless chain of sanctity, one name linking to the next, every gap replaced by grace. The saints that never were became the saints who would never die, for their purpose was not to live, but to make sure history never appeared broken. The sky had always been the one thing no man could forge. Empires could rewrite history, kings could mint new coins, popes could sanctify lies, but the stars above remained untouchable, or so people thought. In the spring of the year 1634, astronomers in Rome prepared for a solar eclipse predicted decades earlier by their predecessors. The event was to be visible across much of Europe, a spectacle of divine design. But when the day came, the sky remained bright. No shadow crossed the sun, no darkness fell upon the city. It was as if the heavens themselves had refused to perform. The scholars panicked. Their tables of calculation, drawn from ancient Greek and Arabic sources, could not be wrong, yet no eclipse had come. The shadow leader, by then the silent hand behind much of the Vatican's internal affairs, saw opportunity where others saw disaster. He understood that faith could not afford contradiction. If the sky defied the Church's timeline, then the sky would have to be corrected. Within hours, he summoned the Vatican's astronomers and mathematicians to a private council. They were instructed to review their data and issue a new conclusion. The eclipse, they were to say, had indeed occurred, but only partially, visible to those pure enough in faith to see it. Those who doubted its happening would reveal their spiritual weakness, not the Church's error. It was a test, not of science, but of loyalty. Some objected, quietly suggesting that perhaps the old calendar reform had shifted the dates too far, but they were silenced. One Jesuit astronomer, who refused to alter his notes, was reassigned to a distant monastery in the Alps. His writings were confiscated, his name later removed from the records. The official bulletin from the Vatican declared the event fulfilled, and all copies of dissenting reports were replaced with new ones dated to match the doctrine. The Shadow Leader's command had turned the heavens themselves into servants of belief. Years later, when astronomers elsewhere tried to compare their records, they found strange inconsistencies. The missing eclipse appeared in some manuscripts but not others, as if time itself had stuttered. The confusion was so complete that later historians dismissed it as human error. But in truth, the Vatican had succeeded in the impossible. It had edited the sky. From that moment onward, no celestial event could be publicly recorded without ecclesiastical approval. Comets, eclipses, and planetary alignments were filtered through the Church's lens before being shared with the world. The Shadow Leader knew the danger of accuracy. True astronomy could measure time with precision, and precision could expose the lies written into history, so he chose to blur it. The night sky became a painted ceiling, beautiful, sacred, and safe. The missing eclipse was never spoken of again. Yet those who lived through that year remembered the silence of that bright day, when the sun refused to dim and the truth itself was eclipsed by obedience. By the middle of the 17th century, the flames of the old Inquisition had begun to fade. The public trials, the chains, the confessions torn from trembling lips, all became scenes the Church no longer wished to show. The world had grown more refined, and the Vatican knew that fear could take softer forms. Torture chambers were replaced with offices, inquisitors with secretaries, and the sword of faith became parchment stamped with seals. This was the new Inquisition, silent, elegant, and far more effective. The Shadow Leader had designed it himself. He understood that open punishment drew attention, but quiet disappearance erased doubt. Scholars who once risked their lives to publish forbidden ideas now found themselves trapped in a different kind of prison. The system of approval known as the imprimatur. Every book, sermon, or lecture required the Church's permission to exist. Those who stayed within the boundaries flourished. They received grants, positions in universities, or invitations to teach within the new Jesuit colleges. But those who crossed invisible lines simply vanished from the world of letters. Their funding stopped. Their patrons withdrew. Their names faded from catalogues and libraries. The Vatican never had to burn a book again. It only needed to stop it from being printed. The method was clean and invisible, a censorship hidden behind politeness. A philosopher in Florence found his research quietly delayed. A mathematician in Paris was told his theories needed theological review before release. A historian who questioned the age of the world discovered his publisher no longer existed. The Shadow Leader's system worked perfectly because it created obedience through hope, not fear. The scholars believed they were free, and that belief made them easy to control. Each one censored himself before writing a word, shaping his thoughts to please unseen judges. The Church called it moderation. In truth, it was submission. Even the universities that claimed independence were linked by threads of funding and influence that led back to Rome. The Jesuit order, loyal to the Silence Accord, ensured that education itself became a filter. Only ideas that strengthened faith were taught. All others were redirected, labelled as speculation or moral risk. By the end of the century, the intellectual world of Europe glittered on the surface, but beneath it lay a vast emptiness. Ideas once alive with fire had been hollowed out, reduced to safe reflections. The Inquisition without chains had succeeded where the old one failed. It had made control invisible. Scholars began to police each other, fearing loss of favour more than loss of truth. The shadow leader watched in silence, knowing his design would last for centuries. He had built a system where minds could be bound without prisons, where silence could be mistaken for peace, and where obedience felt like faith itself. Across Europe, cathedrals rose like mountains of faith, their towers stretching toward heaven, their windows glowing with stories of light and redemption. To most, they were monuments to God, but to a few, they were also messages carved in stone, secret letters written by those who built them. The masons who shaped these walls were more than labourers. They were keepers of an ancient knowledge, trained in geometry, symbolism, and silence. Each carried his own mark, a small sign carved into a hidden corner of the stone to record his work. But not all marks served that purpose. Some were different, subtle, coded. During the early years of the 17th century, whispers began to reach the Vatican that strange symbols had been found within several cathedrals under construction. Circles intersecting triangles, suns carved behind crosses, and patterns that formed maps when traced together. Most priests ignored them as decoration. The shadow leader did not. He saw the pattern for what it was, a silent protest, a language written by those who refused to let the Church's version of truth stand unchallenged. The Masons, bound by oaths older than any papal decree, had found a way to preserve fragments of forbidden wisdom within the very stones of the Church itself. It was knowledge that had survived the burning of libraries and the silence accord, hidden in the open, protected by beauty. One evening, under the flickering glow of oil lamps, the shadow leader studied drawings of the strange marks brought to him from a site in Avignon. He recognized the geometry, the same ratios once used in temples older than Rome. These were not accidents, they were answers. And so he began to reply. In cathedrals built under his supervision, he instructed architects to subtly adjust their designs. A window moved a few inches. A column angled slightly to the east. To the eye, nothing changed. But when the sunlight struck the stone at certain hours, the hidden marks aligned perfectly with new ones, completing shapes that spoke through shadow. It became a quiet conversation between the Church and those who resisted it. An invisible dialogue of faith and defiance. The Masons understood. They continued to leave messages, now confident that someone inside the Vatican could read them. Circles became eyes. Lines formed keys. A secret map of ideas spread across the continent, etched into walls that would stand for centuries. Pilgrims walked beneath them, unaware that the buildings around them were whispering truths long forbidden. The shadow leader never revealed what he learned from these symbols, nor did he betray those who carved them. He knew the world was not ready to see what lay hidden in its own sanctuaries. But the cathedrals remembered. Long after their builders were gone, their walls still spoke in light and shadow, carrying the conversation forward in silence. Those who listened closely, even today, might still hear it, the faint murmur of stone telling the story of a truth that refused to die. In the year 1642, within the echoing streets of Rome, a new college opened its gates under the proud banner of the Society of Jesus. It promised light, learning, and reason, a place where young men could rise through knowledge to serve both faith and empire. But behind its walls, something far more calculated was unfolding. The Jesuit college was no ordinary school. It was a mirror, built not to create thinkers, but reflectors. The shadow leader had seen how open thought could unravel the fabric of obedience. So, he helped shape an education system that appeared progressive, while quietly moulding every mind that entered. Its classrooms were filled with debate, but only of the right kind. Questions were encouraged, so long as the answers led back to doctrine. Students learned philosophy, history, science, and rhetoric, yet every subject curved gently toward the same conclusion. Truth was unity, and unity meant obedience. The Jesuits, masters of persuasion, turned rhetoric into a weapon sharper than any blade. They taught students how to argue flawlessly for the church's position, how to dismantle opposing ideas without violence, and how to make heresy sound foolish even before it was spoken. Language became the scalpel, trimming dangerous thoughts before they could take shape. By graduation, each scholar believed himself enlightened, unaware that his enlightenment had been pre-designed. The shadow leader watched this system with fascination. It was his most elegant creation, a machine that required no chains, no threats. The students policed themselves, competing to prove their loyalty through eloquence. When they entered the world as priests, teachers, and advisors, they carried the mirror within them, reflecting only what they had been taught to see. Soon, the Jesuit college became the model for others across Europe. In Paris, Madrid, Prague, and Vienna, schools of similar design arose, all linked by shared curriculum and tone. The same sermons echoed, the same phrases repeated, as if every classroom drew from one invisible script. A century later, entire generations of scholars would still quote its lessons word for word, believing they were thinking freely when they were only rehearsing. Those few who saw through the illusion paid dearly. One professor in Antwerp, after publishing a treatise questioning divine hierarchy, found his position quietly revoked. Another, a Jesuit himself, wrote that the mind was like glass, meant to refract light, not merely reflect it. His book was confiscated before it could reach print. The college taught him silence more effectively than punishment ever could. By the time the century closed, the Jesuit mirror had become the greatest instrument of mental control the world had ever known. It did not destroy knowledge, it redirected it. It did not forbid thought, it shaped it until truth itself bent gently toward the church. And so, in the polished reflection of that grand institution, the shadow leader saw his triumph. A generation that believed it could see the world, unaware that it was only gazing into a mirror crafted by his hand. In the winter of 1658, deep within the marble corridors of the Vatican, an aging scribe stumbled upon a strange document. It bore the seal of a pope long dead, yet the ink was fresh. The date at the bottom placed it nearly 3 centuries earlier, during an era when Europe was said to have slept in silence. The scribe hesitated before bringing it forward, knowing that to question a papal document was to question history itself. The parchment was carried to the chamber of the shadow leader, who examined it under candlelight. To him, it was not an error, it was an instrument. The document, a rescript or papal brief, appeared to confirm the existence of several decrees supposedly issued in the 7th century, bridging the gap between forgotten reigns and missing archives. It referenced councils that had left no record, saints who had left no trace, and monasteries that had long since turned to dust. Yet the handwriting matched no known style from that age, and the wax seal, though bearing the arms of St. Peter, was of a composition unknown in any prior century. Still, it was declared authentic. With a single stroke of recognition, centuries of silence bloomed with paperwork. The shadow leader understood the value of such invention. If time contained voids, one needed only to fill them with ink. The Church's continuity depended upon unbroken memory, and so documents were quietly produced to prove what had never been witnessed. Each one was carefully backdated, cross-referenced with older chronicles, and sealed with papal authority. Within a few years, entire missing periods gained bureaucratic life. Letters from non-existent bishops appeared, confirming councils that had never convened. Decrees cited other decrees, forming a self-supporting web of truth. Even the most skeptical historian could find no thread loose enough to pull. What began as a single phantom document grew into a vast system of historical grafting. Monasteries received copies for their archives. Scholars were granted permission to quote them, and soon these false witnesses entered the chain of history as fact. The Vatican had not merely written faith. It had rewritten time. Some within the Curia whispered doubts. A young archivist once asked how a document could exist before the invention of the very script in which it was written. His question never reached daylight. The shadow leader ensured such curiosity found quiet ends. In public, the rescripts became symbols of divine continuity. In private, they were tools of precision, instruments to reshape the past into harmony with doctrine. The Church no longer needed to explain the missing centuries. It had proof that they had never been missing at all. Years later, historians would marvel at how seamlessly those centuries seemed to fit. Few realized they were held together by a single forged breath of parchment, the phantom rescript that turned emptiness into eternity, with nothing more than a seal and silence. Beneath the marble floors of the Vatican, past the guarded staircases and sealed bronze doors, lies a sub-archive known to only a handful of curators. Its name appears nowhere in the ledgers. It is spoken of only in whispers as the Vault of Forbidden Maps. Within that dimly lit labyrinth rests a single volume that could upend the world. It is called the Atlas Beneath Rome, a collection of hand-drawn charts unlike any others in history. No one knows who first compiled it, though fragments suggest the work began before the year 1000. Bound in dark leather, its pages are impossibly detailed, depicting coastlines, continents, and islands that modern explorers would not rediscover for another 500 years. One map shows the southern pole without ice. Another traces rivers across lands that today lie beneath the ocean. Margins are filled with precise measurements written in an unknown script, and the compass points do not align with the magnetic north. When the Shadow Leader first saw the atlas, it was by candlelight in a room where even the air seemed to hesitate. He understood at once the danger it posed. If these maps were true, then much of recorded history was false. Civilizations, labelled as primitive, might have possessed knowledge of the entire globe. The Church's tale of darkness and rediscovery would collapse in a single turn of a page. The Shadow Leader ordered the atlas sealed, hidden within the lowest chamber beneath the archives, accessible only through 2 separate keys held by men who would never meet. Yet he could not resist studying it further. Night after night he returned, tracing the lines with his finger, comparing them to known cartographies. He found cities that predated their founding, mountain ranges where deserts now stood, and coastlines that matched no known geography. It was as if someone long ago had seen the earth from the heavens. He began to suspect that the atlas was more than a map. It was a memory, a record of an age erased deliberately. To prevent its discovery, he ordered false copies to be distributed among lesser archives, each altered slightly to match the Church's worldview. These forgeries showed a Europe at the centre of creation, surrounded by blank oceans, safe and familiar. But deep below Rome, the true atlas slept. A rumour spread among scholars of a lost folio within the Vatican that could rewrite history. One Jesuit cartographer, consumed by curiosity, tried to locate it. He vanished before the year 1670 began, his name erased from the rolls. The shadow leader's caution had paid off. For centuries since, the atlas has remained hidden, untouched, yet still alive in legend. Those who know of it say that if a single folio were ever released, the illusion of the known world would crumble, and the sermons of 1,000 years would no longer align with the shape of the earth itself. In the year 1676, a historian named Lorenzo de Sarti emerged from the halls of the Jesuit college with a manuscript that promised to change the way Europe understood its past. His work was titled The Dawn of Civilization, a sweeping history that traced the rebirth of knowledge after the fall of Rome. Scholars hailed him as a genius. Princes sent for copies. Even the Vatican approved its printing with remarkable speed. Yet within the leather binding, between chapter 5 and chapter 7, there was a gap, a missing section where the heart of his argument should have been. The pages simply jumped ahead, as if nothing had ever been there. Readers noticed, of course, but the preface offered an elegant excuse. The missing chapter, Lorenzo explained, had been lost in a fire during his youth. The church praised his humility for continuing the work despite such tragedy. He was celebrated as a model of faith and perseverance. His book spread across Europe, translated into Latin, French, and Spanish, becoming the foundation for how future generations would imagine the so-called Dark Ages. What few knew was that the missing chapter had never burned. It had been taken. Lorenzo's original manuscript contained a section that questioned the official timeline of history. Drawing on astronomical data, he argued that the early centuries of the Middle Ages did not align with celestial records. Some events, he wrote, seemed to have occurred twice, while others appeared to have never happened at all. He believed entire centuries might have been added by error or intention. It was a daring hypothesis, one that would later echo through the phantom time theory. But before the book went to print, the shadow leader read the draft. He saw the danger instantly. Exposing the manipulation of time would unravel the church's authority over history itself. So he invited Lorenzo to Rome under the pretense of offering patronage. In a quiet chamber within the Vatican library, the shadow leader praised his brilliance, then gently suggested revisions. The chapter on timelines, he said, could confuse the faithful. It might even diminish Lorenzo's reputation if misunderstood. Better to remove it, for the good of the church and his own legacy. The scholar hesitated, but ambition is a subtle leash. He agreed, and the offending chapter was quietly filed away among restricted manuscripts. The edited book made Lorenzo famous. Universities competed to honor him. Statues were carved in his likeness. He believed he had succeeded, and in a way he had. The world adored his name, but not his truth. The missing chapter, the one that might have changed everything, remained hidden behind marble walls. Years later, when Lorenzo was old and nearly blind, he confessed to a student that his best work was never printed. The student thought he spoke in metaphor, but the shadow leader knew better. Sometimes the surest way to silence a voice is not to destroy it, but to let it speak almost everything. Lorenzo became immortal for forgetting his book, and that was exactly how the Vatican wanted it. In the spring of 1683, a new pope ascended the throne of St. Peter. His name was Innocent XI, and though his election brought cheers to Rome, it also brought unease within the Vatican's higher circles. He was a man of piety but with little lineage, a reformer without roots. The nobles whispered that he lacked the grandeur of his predecessors. The scholars murmured that his name carried no echo in the ancient halls of Christendom. To rule the faithful a pope required more than faith. He required history. The shadow leader, ever alert to such fractures, knew that power could not thrive in uncertainty. So he decided to gift the Holy Father what he lacked, a past older than doubt. The idea was not new. The Church had long shaped its story through relics and records, but this time the deception needed to be flawless. It had to feel like discovery, not invention. In secret, the shadow leader arranged for the excavation of an abandoned monastery on the outskirts of Rome. There, beneath the cracked floor of the chapel, workers were instructed to find what had already been placed. Within a week, the world learned of an astonishing rediscovery. Ancient papal documents, supposedly buried for centuries, had been unearthed. They bore the seal of an early pontiff, one forgotten by scholars, who appeared to bless a prophecy that foretold the coming of a reformer pope named Innocent. The ink was perfectly aged, the parchment brittle and fragrant with time. Experts called to examine it nodded in awe. The Church declared it a miracle of providence. To the public, the rediscovery was proof that Innocent's reign had been destined since the dawn of Christianity. To the Vatican, it was a masterpiece of manipulation. The shadow leader had written the text himself, drawing from fragments of Latin scripture and the cadence of older papal bulls. He embedded subtle references to real historical councils, ensuring that the forged prophecy would blend seamlessly with the known record. Even scholars who sensed the illusion could not disprove it. The Church's archive, the only place where verification was possible, was under his control. The new pope embraced the revelation with humility, thanking heaven for affirming his mission. But deep down, he too understood the theatre. He needed legitimacy, and legitimacy needed myth. He blessed the relics, ordered the monastery restored, and had the prophecy read aloud before thousands in St. Peter's Square. The crowd wept, believing they had witnessed divine continuity. History had spoken, and it spoke in Latin. The shadow leader stood in the shadows of the colonnade, unseen, listening to the chants rise into the evening air. He had done what every true manipulator of history must do, turn invention into memory. From that day on, Innocent's authority was unshakable. The nobles fell silent, the scholars bowed, and the people believed. The rediscovered prophecy was placed in the Vatican vaults for preservation, never to be tested again. The Pope had been given a past, and with it, the Church gained another century of control. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe stood on the edge of a new age. Painters, poets, and philosophers spoke of rebirth, a renaissance of light after the long shadows of the Middle Ages. But few asked the question that mattered most. Where did this light come from? Who decided that humanity was now ready to see again? In truth, the so-called rediscovery of knowledge was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated, deep beneath the Vatican, in the endless halls of its archives. The shadow leader controlled a floodgate of forgotten texts. Ancient manuscripts, scientific treatises, and pagan philosophies slept behind stone walls, sealed away during centuries of darkness. Now he began to open them, but not freely. He released them like drops from a pipette, one revelation at a time, each carefully timed to shape the world's awakening. The first texts to surface were safe translations of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen. They spoke of harmony, virtue, and divine order, ideas that strengthened the Church's moral foundation even as they appeared secular. Scholars rejoiced, believing they had discovered the roots of Western reason. The Vatican allowed them to bask in that illusion. But for every scroll released, 10 remained locked away. The dangerous ones, those that questioned creation, time, or the nature of divinity, were quietly withheld. The shadow leader understood the rhythm of revelation. Too much truth at once could drown faith. Too little, and curiosity would fade. So he designed a balance, a calculated awakening. Each new discovery arrived like a miracle, feeding the illusion that Europe was lifting itself from darkness through genius alone. In Florence, artists painted frescoes inspired by Greek ideals, newly translated from Latin. In Venice, printers celebrated the birth of the printing press as if it were divine inspiration. And in Rome, the Vatican smiled, for every triumph of the Renaissance led back to their archives. Even the scholars who believed themselves rebels worked unknowingly within the boundaries set by the Church. Every manuscript they quoted had passed through the shadow leader's inspection. Every rediscovery had been planned years in advance. When certain scientists began to probe too deeply, proposing that the Earth might not be the center of the universe, the flood slowed. The flow of manuscripts shifted toward theology, toward mysticism, toward safer inquiries into beauty and proportion. The Church encouraged the study of light in art, not in astronomy. The public, dazzled by beauty, never saw the restraint behind the spectacle to the world. The Vatican had become the silent guardian of civilization. To the shadow leader, it was the perfect experiment, 1,000 minds illuminated just enough to follow, never enough to lead. By the century's end, the Renaissance had transformed Europe, yet it had done so within invisible walls. The archives remained full, their deepest shelves untouched. The floodgate had opened only a fraction, and even that small stream reshaped the world. The shadow leader's design endured, proof that the brightest light could still be controlled, as long as the hand that released it remembered to never let the flood become a storm. By the late 19th century, the age of ink and parchment had given way to a new power, the image. Painters, engravers, and later photographers began to shape how humanity saw its own past. Yet behind the beauty of art, a quiet manipulation was taking place. The Church no longer needed to write history. It only needed to show it. For centuries, words had been debated, but images went unquestioned. They reached the heart before the mind could resist. The shadow leader's successors understood this perfectly. And so the Dark Ages, a term once whispered among scholars, was given a face, a colour, and a feeling. In paintings and prints across Europe, the Middle Ages became a world of smoke, mud, and superstition. Artists portrayed peasants in tattered clothes bowing before towering cathedrals. Priests loomed in candlelight. Monks guarded ancient books as if protecting humanity from itself. Even the light in these works was dim, filtered through storm clouds or flickering torches. Darkness became more than metaphor. It became memory. In the early 20th century, cinema inherited this palette. Silent films about medieval times filled theatres with the same imagery, endless nights and echoing cathedrals. Directors, guided by historians trained on the Church's version of the past, reinforced the myth that 1,000 years of ignorance had passed before the Renaissance brought light. No one noticed that the pattern of lighting, costume, and tone was identical to religious paintings centuries earlier. It was the same story told through a new lens. As film evolved, so did the control of perception. The Church no longer needed to censor history. It simply let artists repeat the story already burned into collective imagination. A world of darkness before the light, ignorance before salvation, chaos before order. The same pattern appeared in textbooks, posters, even school plays. Children learned to fear the past as a wasteland of superstition. No one asked who had painted it that way. When the first documentaries about history appeared in the mid-20th century, the myth became unshakable. Voiceovers spoke of backward centuries. Scenes showed barren villages, stone walls, and frightened faces lit by candles. The Vatican was rarely blamed, but always present, a steady glow of faith amid the gloom. Viewers absorbed the message without question. The Dark Ages were real because they looked real. The tone was so consistent that even scholars who doubted the term found it impossible to escape its influence. By the 21st century, digital media carried this same imagery into every corner of the world. The shadow had become the story. The line between artistic style and historical truth had vanished. The Dark Ages no longer needed to be proven. They were remembered through colour, through light, through the quiet repetition of a mood that had begun in the Vatican's own halls. The film of memory had hardened into fact. The greatest illusion in history was no longer written on paper. It was projected on every screen, and no one remembered who had first chosen the darkness. By the middle of the 19th century, the Church had already mastered the adult mind, but it was the child the shadow leader's heirs truly sought. If history could be introduced early enough, shaped not as a question, but as a rhythm, it would never be questioned at all. And so the classroom became the new cathedral. Within those walls, the timeline of the world was boiled down to charts and dates, sainted heroes and villainous heretics. It was tidy, it was clean, it was never neutral. The earliest version of this began with catechisms, small books of questions and answers designed to imprint belief like ink pressed into damp paper. Who made the world? Who saved it? Who speaks for God on earth? Over time, these books expanded beyond faith. They became history, geography, even early science. The same voice that explained heaven now explained the past. Children memorized empires and inventions in the same tone they recited prayers. By the early 20th century, the system had become national. Governments adopted these catechism-inspired textbooks as official curricula. The Vatican did not control the ministries of education directly, but it no longer needed to. The frameworks had already been set. In France, in Spain, in Austria, and beyond, school books taught the same timeline. The Dark Ages followed the fall of Rome. The Church preserved knowledge through monastic scribes. The Renaissance arrived like sunlight. Reformation came as a dangerous fracture, and always, behind each era, the silent hand of Rome guided history forward. The timeline was presented as fact, printed in bold, boxed with illustrations, sealed with footnotes. It never showed its edits. The missing centuries were not labelled missing, they were simply quiet. The forged saints appeared without question. The false rescript stood among real documents. No child could know the difference. Teachers were trained to repeat, not to challenge. Exams rewarded memory, not curiosity. The Church had created a classroom machine, one that reproduced its version of truth, generation after generation. A young student could grow up believing he had learned freely, never realizing that every map, every date, every portrait had passed through the same filter. Even when secular reforms touched the system, they changed only the surface. The structure remained, the dates remained, the tidy timeline was too familiar to erase. Scholars who tried to untangle the past from its catechism roots found themselves drowned in arguments that relied not on research, but on the deep emotional imprint of early education. The classroom had done its work. It had made memory mechanical. The Vatican's greatest success was not in controlling what people believed, but when they began to believe it. By planting its version of history in childhood, it ensured that no matter what a person read later in life, the shape of time itself would never change. The past had become a lesson, and lessons, once memorized, rarely fade. In the autumn of 1701, an aging astronomer named Paolo Viscardi completed his final manuscript. He had spent 30 years charting the stars from a small observatory near Naples, working mostly in silence, known more for his precision than for any grand discoveries. His work was considered safe, approved, predictable, but in the margins of his last book, just beside a page describing the accepted order of the planets, he wrote something that changed everything. It was a single line, scrawled in faded ink. The pattern of conjunctions suggests the sky does not move as we have been told. He did not elaborate. There was no diagram, no bold declaration, just a quiet observation hidden in the edge of the page, as if whispered to no one. When the manuscript arrived at the Vatican Library for cataloguing, a clerk noticed the note. At first, he assumed it was a copyist's error, but the ink matched the rest of the book. It was Viscardi's hand. The shadow leader of that era was informed. He read the line twice, then closed the book gently. It was not the content that alarmed him. Many had said worse. It was the placement. The note had been allowed to exist. If left untouched, future readers might trace it, follow its logic, begin to question. But to destroy the book would raise more suspicion. Viscardi had been a respected figure. His death had been peaceful, his life without scandal. A public denial would only draw attention, so the solution was surgical. The book remained in the archive, but when it was rebound for preservation, the margin was trimmed, just enough to remove the note, not enough for anyone to notice. The official catalogue still listed the manuscript. Scholars could request it, read it, cite it, but the last footnote was gone. The observation that challenged the sky had vanished with a single slice of the blade. In private, a copy of the original page was made and stored in the sub-archive, known only to a handful. It was filed not under astronomy, but under deviation. Over the years, rumours of Viscardi's missing note began to surface. A student of his once claimed to have seen it. Another said he remembered his teacher discussing a theory too dangerous to publish. But without proof, their claims faded. The Church had done what it did best. It had allowed the truth to exist just long enough to be erased without protest. The story of Viscardi's footnote is still told in whispers among archivists. They speak of the line that should have changed the way we see the heavens, the one that lived and died in the margin. In the end, the stars above remained fixed, not because they were, but because no one was allowed to see where they truly moved. And the astronomer who saw too much became another name remembered for the pages he left behind, never for the words that were taken from them. In the year 1929, headlines around the world celebrated a miracle of transparency. After centuries of secrecy, the Vatican announced it would open its apostolic archive to the public. Scholars cheered. Journalists wrote of a new era of honesty. For the first time, they said, history would be allowed to speak without a filter. But inside the Vatican, behind the scenes, the shadow leader's lineage had already prepared the performance. The opening was not a surrender, it was a stage. As dignitaries toured the marble corridors and camera flashes lit the halls once sealed in shadow, carefully selected documents were unveiled. Medieval letters, papal bulls, fragments of ancient maps, even faded court records from the Inquisition. Each artifact was just mysterious enough to impress, just harmless enough to distract. These were the curiosities, the safe bones of old power. But the true vault, the core archive, was never touched. Its existence was not denied. It was simply never named. Catalogues handed to researchers listed only what had already been curated. No mention of the phantom rescript. No hint of the Atlas beneath Rome. The saints that never were remained sainted. The rewritten calendars still ticked forward as if nothing had ever been changed. In place of danger, the scholars were given puzzles, a torn letter from a forgotten cardinal, a faded diagram of a failed siege. Enough to make the search feel real, enough to fill lectures and articles and footnotes. One professor from Berlin wept upon seeing a manuscript he had studied for years in fragments. Another from Boston declared it the most important moment in modern Catholic scholarship. The illusion was perfect. Even the critics admitted that the access, though partial, was a victory. No one thought to ask whether the vault had ever truly opened. Behind the outer archive, past an unmarked wall, and beneath a different set of keys, the untouchable collection remained. It held the letters never sent, the doctrines never spoken, the truths too large to live. Its shelves were built not to preserve memory, but to protect the present from the weight of what had been buried. And at the centre of that silence stood a ledger with no title, where the shadow leaders had signed only with symbols. The church knew it could survive exposure, but not revelation, so it chose performance. It allowed the world to believe it had been invited inside, while keeping the heart of its past behind glass, thicker than belief. The archives had been opened, yes, but only as much as a painting opens a window. You can look in, but you cannot step through. And so, in the hour the vault opened, the truth remained asleep. The world read its history in a room full of light, unaware that behind them, the real story waited in shadow, untouched, unnamed, and perfectly protected. In the spring of 2013, a young data researcher named Elian Marchesi sat hunched in a university basement surrounded by servers that hummed like insects. He was 23 years old and had never published a paper. His professors barely remembered his name. But Elian had something they did not. Access. Not to secrets, but to patterns. He had digitized over 30,000 records from religious archives, star charts, saint calendars, and historical atlases. His thesis was supposed to be about the influence of religious holidays on agricultural planning. It did not stay that way for long. While comparing eclipse data with feast days from the 6th through the 9th centuries, Elian noticed something strange. The eclipses were wrong. According to NASA's celestial calculations, several recorded eclipses never happened. Others that should have been visible across Europe were missing from every account. At first, he thought it was an error in transcription, but then he saw it again in the maps. Regions were labelled with names that should not have existed yet. Some cities were marked centuries before they were supposedly founded. And buried in the margins of saint records, he found the same odd phrasing repeated across different languages and countries. Each one used a version of the phrase, by providence of the Holy Witness. Elian started colour-coding the anomalies, red for calendar errors, blue for geographic inconsistencies, yellow for saint overlaps. After weeks of sleepless nights, he saw what no one else had seen: the pattern. Across nearly 400 years, these distortions formed a web of corrections so precise it could not be accidental. Someone had reshaped history as if editing a manuscript. Events had been shifted, added, trimmed, and relabeled. Time had been adjusted like lines on a ruler. The most chilling part was the consistency. The edits followed a style, the same phrases, the same symmetrical margins, the same theological vocabulary. It was the handwriting of one mind. Elian did not know his name, but we do, the shadow leader. Terrified but driven, Elian tried to publish his findings. No journals accepted the work. He was told his datasets were incomplete, that he had misunderstood religious context. One editor told him plainly that he was flirting with conspiracy. Still, he uploaded a summary of his research to a public archive. Within 48 hours, the post was gone. His account was deleted. His university revoked his access to the archive servers. He was warned not to press the matter, but somewhere a few people had already downloaded the data. The pattern was too clear to stay hidden forever. Someone had rewritten history, and the fingerprints of that editor stretched across centuries, unseen by those who had trusted the timeline since childhood. Elian now lives quietly, under a different name, but the seed he uncovered has already taken root in hidden corners of the internet. The undoing of time has begun, not as a revolt, but as a realization. The past, it turns out, was edited, and someone is finally reading the footnotes. The final entry in the private Vatican ledger bore no name, no date, only a sentence written in delicate Latin script. Release everything. The ink was darker than the rest, fresher, as if whoever had written it had waited for just the right moment, then vanished into silence before the page could dry. It was not a command. It was a test. For nearly 1,000 years, the Shadow Leader had been more myth than man. A thread of presence passed through different hands, different eras, always working in silence. Some thought he had been one person. Others believed it was a role inherited in secrecy, like a cloak passed through time. Either way, by the early 21st century, his office no longer existed on paper. There were no chambers, no signatures, only echoes. Yet the vault remained. Within it sat every sealed document, every redacted folio, every truth too sharp to show the world, the phantom rescript, the atlas beneath Rome, the missing footnotes and the false saints, even the forged timelines now recognized as gospel. All of it remained untouched, preserved, unquestioned. Until the final note, the instruction unsettled the few who found it. One archivist wept when she read it. Another locked it away again, unsure if it was real. But one by one, others came to see it. They said nothing publicly. They held meetings without minutes. They sat in the very room where the Atlas had first been hidden, asking a question older than the church itself. What if people were ready? The idea of revealing everything was not without risk. To release the truth would shatter the timelines children had memorized for centuries. It would challenge the authority of saints, the foundation of calendars, even the accepted history of civilization. But it would also bring clarity. It would return the light. The question was never about whether the world could handle the truth. It was about whether the truth still mattered. If people had lived so long inside a crafted memory, would they even care that it had been shaped? One scholar argued for silence. He said that without the myth, the center would collapse. But another, much younger, said something no one could refute. The myth already collapsed. We are only pretending it stands. So the final test of faith was set in motion, not for the public, for the guardians. Could they choose truth without being forced? Could they trust the light, not to blind? No ceremony marked the moment. No headline announced it. Just a subtle change in the archives. A few files unlocked. A map restored. A footnote returned. Slowly, the gate began to open. Some say the Shadow Leader never wanted power, only clarity. That his greatest act was not in controlling history, but in letting it go. Not in rewriting the world, but in trusting it to remember. And in that quiet decision, he passed the torch, not with orders or doctrine, but with light. The kind that does not blind, the kind that waits to be seen.